This article is the second part of an article you can find on my LinkedIn profile. As is almost always the case, I have published the article on my blog site as well at www.ideliversoft.com. In this second article, I will show you how to configure access restrictions to the Azure functions. I have created this setup for implementing access restrictions and a private endpoint with a premium plan some time ago. In the meantime, I have cleaned up my Azure resources to limit the cost. I will demo this particular part by reviewing the screenshots I have saved in a Word document. In the second part of this article, I will show you how to set up selected permissions to a particular SharePoint site using two separate application registrations. Let's start talking about access restrictions. In the design and configuration I have created, the only point of access for the SharePoint APIs is the API management endpoints. These endpoints are protected by a certificate, and a client application will have to present this certificate when making the calls. On the other hand, the Azure functions needs TP be configured in such a way that they cannot be called directly. There are two ways to configure access restrictions to the Azure functions. The first way is to use access restrictions in an app service for inbound access only. These access restrictions are equivalent to a firewall, allowing you to filter traffic. The second alternative is to create a private endpoint by creating a virtual network and placing the API management inside it. As the private endpoint is the Microsoft preferred solution, it has to be noted that the price for configuring it in a premium plan is significant. The simplest implementation as described in these screenshots costs somewhere between $100 to $150 per day. If you have to add a service bus into this implementation for a premium account, you can see the price is even more significant. Configuring the access restrictions can be done in a consumption plan as well. You need to open your Azure Function app and add an access rule to allow inbound calls from the Azure API management IP address. Setting up the API management in a virtual network is a more laborious configuration. There are a number of resources that needs to be created and configured as public IP address, virtual network, subnets, private endpoints, network security groups. You can see here the inbound and outbound security rules for setting up the network security group. As the screenshots indicates, the calls to the API management endpoints are working. At the same time, the calls to the Azure functions protected by the private endpoint does not succeed. You can recreate the configuration described in these screenshots if you follow the Microsoft documentation. Deploy to a VNet, external. To complete this section describing how to configure access restrictions to our Azure functions, here are a couple of notes to help you with this process. If your function app has been already added to the private endpoint, you will not be able to deploy the build. As a workaround, make the function public, deploy the build, and make the function app private again. Here is an article on the Microsoft site that describes how to set up the permission so that a particular app registration can have access to selected SharePoint sites only. While the first article is from 2021, a more recent article from February 2024 shows the similar fix for the delegated permissions. How does it work? You need to create two separate app registrations. an app registration that acts as an administrator, and a separate one that provides selected permission to one or more SharePoint sites. The administrator app registration needs to have the site's full control, all permission, and can be protected by a certificate. The secondary app registration permission is sites. Selected. In Postman, get an access token from the administrator app registration. Using this token, you can read or set the permissions for any SharePoint site. Note that with this token, you can make a call to any Graph API and read or update any of the SharePoint sites. Now, I am getting the permissions for the second site and the third site. The second site has a write permission while the third site has a read permission. This is how you can make a call and set a permission for a site. To perform our test, let's get a token to the app registration which has a write permission to the second site and a read permission to the third site. The Graph API calls that reads the second and the third site can execute. The Graph API calls that updates the second site will execute as well. The Graph API calls that updates the third site will be denied as the app registration has only read access to the third site. Let's perform the same test, but first, let's change the app registration permission to the third site to write. Following that, we will be able to update the color property for this SharePoint item. As a final note, let's open the Graph API documentation and see that we have only two permissions when reading and updating an item via the Graph APIs. I have arrived at the end of this article. I hope you find this article interesting and that it will help you in your work. I invite you to keep reviewing the articles I am writing on my blog site and on LinkedIn. Thank you for your time and good luck in what you do.